Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Highway to Healthy Schools Districts on the Road to Achieving Efficient Carbon Neutral Schools webinar hosted by New Buildings Institute. Today we have about an hour. It will be just discussing the topic amongst our panelists. So I hope you all enjoy. Definitely feel free to chat in the chat. And if you have any questions, put that in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Thank you, Soraya, and welcome everyone. As Soraya said, we are here for Highway to Healthy Schools, Districts on the Road to Achieving Efficient Carbon Neutral Schools. I'm Riley Loveland. I'm a Senior Project Manager here at New Buildings Institute. I can see from our attendees that I know many of you, so hello friends, nice to see you. And I guess it's good morning and good afternoon, depending on what coast and what part of the US you're in. New Buildings Institute, we push for better buildings that achieve zero energy, zero carbon, also healthy and efficient buildings and beyond through research, policy guidance, and market transformation to, most importantly, protect the people and the planet. And today we're really talking about protecting the youngest of the people. So we have an awesome panel. I'm going to do this very quickly. I have like a very short intro because we have some really amazing panelists who are going to speak to us today from all over the US. We have Jackie Wilson-Mueller from Bend Lapine Schools here in the state of Oregon. I'm in Portland, Oregon. We have Andy Weiland from Oregon School District in Wisconsin, which is not in Oregon, which is quite funny to me. Leanne Kittle and Adam West are joining us from Denver Public Schools. All right, so just again, very quickly, the context here is that last year, NBI put out a road mapping guide for getting schools to carbon neutrality. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I always have to include this just in case. That the reason that we are really focused on carbon neutral schools is because of increased student and staff health and productivity. There's educational benefits. You can get lower operating costs. There can be lower construction costs if you really plan it and think it through. And then, of course, it can contribute to more resilient communities. So one thing that we noticed in talking to school districts like these three on the call today or in other school districts is that there are these key approaches and outcomes to school decarb. Every school starts in a different place. Some of them do, like 5 of the 6 here, but the important thing is that these are sort of the key ones that we've seen. So the presenters today are going to talk about different aspects of how they approach this and what was the most important for them and how they were really able to achieve and are on this path to achieving carbon neutrality. This is just like a visual representation because one of the things that you'll notice from all of these is that the common thing is that they all set goals. So goal setting and really having that like not just portfolio but project approach. This is a really good representation of the portfolio approach because you're taking into consideration 4 life cycle events in the building life cycle or all the major life cycle events that you can use to continually drive towards that like healthy, efficient, carbon neutral goal. So again, we put together this toolkit. Something I'm noticing that these photos are very pixely. I converted it to a PDF. I'm sorry, things happen. So I apologize. But so we put out this roadmap guide last April. It includes templates, it includes key messaging, it includes, just help and approaches for how to implement carbon neutrality in schools. And big news, we have updates coming soon because it would not be a fast-paced changing world if we were not continually updating. So we'll have different topics included. We'll have updated templates. We're going to touch on some things like embodied carbon. So we're moving past the operational carbon. Get ready. We don't have a launch date for that yet, but it is coming. And we are responding to a lot of you asking for specific things like addressing EV and fleet. So here's just some example of some of the tools in the toolbox, like key messages, templates, and then we have a list of other schools that have carbon neutral related resolutions or policies. Here is the link. Oh, great question. There's questions in the chat. I see it already. I will address that at the end because that is a great question. Here's the link. We'll also put it in the chat. And then at the end of my slides, there'll be other resources. But for now, I'm going to yield my time to Jackie Wilson here. I have to do a little switch, a little technology switch here. We're still living in the Zoom era. All right, Jackie, I pass it on to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Riley. Hi, everyone. I am the Sustainability Manager with Bend Lapine School District. So we are in Central Oregon on the east side of the Cascades on the east side of I-5. And we're here because it's really exciting. We're kind of just getting started in this process. and seeing where that decarbonization started. It's really looking at how we started it and where we are in kind of the beginning of the process. And what's really great is seeing that it started really with those stakeholders and key champions. So I'll talk a little bit about that and kind of where we are. So Riley, if we can go forward, thank you. Okay, so the biggest thing was about 4 years ago, we had a really passionate board member who loved sustainability, and what she championed, which changed kind of how Ben Lapine did everything, was she put into the EL7, which is the executive limitation for our superintendent, this idea of sustainability and creating a sustainability plan that is updated, managed every 5 years, and that it will address facility development, improvement, operation, maintenance, identifying short and long-term, and ensuring data collection. All of these things essentially were, before she was there, we had this sustainability idea that was done in 2009, but no one really cared about it besides me, and I wasn't working for the school district at the time. I was at a small local nonprofit, so it didn't work great. And so truly the first step in our, start on this mission was to get that champion and to build more stakeholders. So once we got this new EL7 that directed the superintendent, we created a new sustainability plan. So we created it in 2020. We brought it to the school board. We brought it to our new superintendent. And now we're really starting to see huge changes going on. The quick image is just as we developed buildings, we're putting in LED lighting, but it doesn't mean we're really working toward net zero or decarbonization. It wasn't until we had this champion. And then forward, Riley. So with our new plan, really when I consider what I do for the district, I'm trying to create this culture of stewardship and conservation and really doing it through action, education, but also how we build things. So our plan for sustainability has 4 main goals. And again, this plan was done because of this amazing champion and then myself that was eventually hired onto the school district to do this work. So we've split it into these 4 focus areas of education, building operations, transportations, and materials management. And the big one to talk about today is really looking at our building and operations. So we're looking at, within this plan, how are we designing new buildings? How are we updating our existing buildings? How are we doing that in a way that's really focusing on efficiency and conservation, renewable energy, and this idea of striving toward net zero? I think when the first plan was created in 2020, the idea of making a net zero school scared a lot of our facility and maintenance guys. So that idea of striving for it was put in it. But what's fantastic is we have to update it every 5 years. And so the next time, that's where I'm going to really be pushing toward how are we going toward net zero schools. Next slide, please. Awesome. So within our mission in the plan, this is where we've come up with what we're doing for our schools. So what we're looking to do is not only these healthy built environments, but this, again, striving for net zero energy through comprehensive integration of efficiency, renewable energy, and optimal conservation strategies. Now that I'm fully on with the school district, which happened in August, I'm also working out of our facility development office. So that allows me to work with our new buildings. We have a new bond going in right now. So it's fantastic when we're meeting with architects and all of the firms that we can bring this information to them so they can see what we're really trying to do as a district. Next slide, please.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So with that, it's cool that one image is, this is a new cafeteria that was put on last year and came online in the summertime, that we did get a grant for some renewables on it, which is really great. When we're looking at some of the things we're doing within our sustainability plan on this pathway, it's looking to increase renewables. I've been working with this district for a long time. The fact that we even got anything in renewables is amazing to me. We currently have about 200 kW, so we're really looking to increase it. I would love to see that goal be 500 in the next 2 years, and then continuing to update what we're doing. So when we're looking at our EUI target, we're trying to get 25 for any new buildings and a portfolio goal of 35 by 2030. Currently, our portfolio goal is about 55. Caldera is our brand new high school. I have some images of it in there. It's a pretty impressive building that was put on. And right now, when I'm doing the EUI data, it's coming in at about a 24 EUI. where Ben Senior High School is in our new bond. So that building will be completely remodeled and renovated, which is what I'm assisting with. And right now, the average EUI of that building is 68. So with that, we're really looking to change it. And then in our sustainability plan, when we're reviewing building design standards, it says specifically in the plan that we're striving toward net zero, prioritizing envelope, HVAC, lighting, and equipment. So that's all really important stuff that was never done before. So this is going to be, for this new bond, some brand new things that's happening. Next slide, please. Fantastic. So this is the media center of Caldera, our new high school. Lots of natural light, lots of LED lighting. It's a really beautiful building, which is really great. And so with this, when we're saying net zero ready, what does that mean? So within our new bond and new buildings, we're looking at putting in a sustainability charrette at the outset of it, reviewing really the building envelope as we're getting started with it, and designing for LEED. So Caldera came in at a LEED silver equivalent. Currently, we're not getting LEED certification. I'm hoping maybe that shifts in the next year or two, where we're actually going for the certification. But right now, we're at least designing to LEED standards, which is fantastic to get us net zero ready. And then the next slide. Oh, and this one, I just threw that in there because this is another important one, at least with our construction management plan. And I'm making sure that folks know beyond to try and get, when we're designing buildings, like designing so that we're set so that we can actually like think about materials management in the design of buildings. But with that, it's all just kind of the starts that Ben Lapine is doing. And I think we're really on this great pathway. And what's fantastic is having NBI with us in Oregon. It just allows us to work more with them, and in this new bond, really take some of the templates that they have and use them as we're trying to design new schools and getting toward, if not toward net zero, which is fantastic.
Thank you so much, Jackie. That was phenomenal. Thank you so much for setting the stage as well. And I'm going to pass it off to Andy.
Thank you, Riley. I appreciate it. So my name is Andy Wound. I'm the business manager of Oregon School District, and want to tell you a little bit about our story to achieving the first net zero school district in Wisconsin. So the school is right here before you. It opened in September of 2020, and the name of it is Forest Edge Elementary School. You notice there's a forest right behind it. So next slide, please. Actually, you can probably skip this one too. So a little bit about our agenda today. Thought we'd quickly define what net zero is. I've actually given this presentation a few times, and so sometimes folks are a little curious about that. Some acknowledgements and bragging rights, how we got to net zero. There's a little bit of a story there. Some of our strategies that we had, there's two main ones, but there's a few others that we've also implemented. The operational impact, I'm the business manager, so that means I care about money. And share a little bit of information about that, including an update I made last night, and teaching and learning impact, which I'll share is related to our story as well. Next slide. So net zero is defined by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory as the zero energy building, basically making as much energy as it consumes on an annual basis. So that's real important for people to understand that it is on an annual basis. Some of the discussions that we had early on that kind of pushed us in this direction were that I had board members that thought you just unplug the building from the grid and you're all set. Not quite. There's a little bit more to it than that. And so it's important to understand that there are times during the year the building does require energy from the grid, and at times we're helping basically power the neighborhood. Next slide. So some bragging rights. Up in the upper left-hand corner on your screen, it says 5th largest verified net zero school by the way, the New Building Institute. We check that database a couple times a year. It used to be the largest verified net zero school in the United States. Actually, it was in North America, I believe, until Myrtle Beach added 4 or 5 buildings last summer. So I tell everybody that it's a little harder to achieve net zero in Oregon, Wisconsin, compared to Myrtle Beach. So I still feel like that's a pretty good bragging right. But we are over 126,000 square feet building, so we're a decent size. We have 1,704 solar panels on the building, which translates to, I have to remember this, about 650 kWp. And we have 99 geothermal wells that go down 406 feet. Next slide. So a little bit about our background and how we kind of got to net zero. Next slide. It really started with a couple things happening, and they weren't necessarily like real step-by-step type of thing. There were kind of a lot of different things happening one after another in different order and that type of thing. But we had a group of staff members who were kind of interested at our middle school, science teachers and also our STEM teachers. But also we had the Board of Education, and there was some connections between these folks and a local Rotary group that were kind of pushing the board to do something. So basically our Board of Education has this interesting history of creating position papers where they'll study a topic. Could be things related to academic achievement, obviously, or it could also be related to, obviously, sustainability or alcohol and drugs in schools, that type of thing. And so they took upon themselves to kind of create this paper, this position paper, and they put it in policy so that it gave us direction. Next slide, please. And here's just a small part of it, but basically I'll read the highlighted part. It's to develop learners who are ecologically literate and environmentally responsible citizens and stewards. And in that regard, there's two components to it. One is to develop building and operational practices and procedures that are committed to environmental sustainability, but also to work with our students to make sure that they're getting curriculum that integrates these types of ideas into there as well. So I'm obviously in charge of kind of that first one, the operational and building practices. And as we kind of worked through this process, as I said, we had board members who thought this was easy, that we would just kind of, unplug for the grid, put a bunch of solar panels on the building and we're good to go. And they said, that's difficult. If we ever have an opportunity to build a new building, we absolutely need to do some things a little bit differently than we've had in the past. And so Forest Edge came up fairly quickly after we had those discussions within a few years. And we'll talk about kind of how we got there in the next slides. So in the beginning, it started really with our science teachers wanting to know how much energy our building used at the middle school. So this was kind of a cool idea. They actually brought in a contractor and said, hey, have you ever seen this device? And I've been talking about it for a while. I have no stock in the company or anything like that, but it's a nice entryway for schools or anybody really to get a feel for your energy profile you're building, what's going on with it. I use these devices constantly, especially I love using them on snow days or weekends, just kind of to get a quick view of what's going on with the building to make sure that things are running. So they're really easy to implement, and it's totally data-driven decisions for you there. So it's called an eGauge Pro, and I recommend you look into it if you get a chance. Next slide. So the next thing was, well, what can we do with that data? Now we can see what the building's using. How do we make solar relevant to our students at our middle school? So the first thing we did is we just put one solar panel up next to the science classroom, which is right there. And then we connected it actually to a battery. And what's most relevant to students, somewhat unfortunately these days, their cell phones. So by charging the battery, we let the students then charge their cell phones off that Duracell battery that you see on the right-hand corner there. So, and actually it was so popular that we added another one. We actually have two of them right now. So that was kind of our next step. How do we do that without going crazy with anything, but just maybe, $1,000 type of thing. And I think actually the company donated the solar panel for us. Next slide. Well, the next thing that happened was we actually did pass a referendum to improve most of our buildings, all except our newest building, which at the time was built in 2020, 2000, I'm sorry. So we had some older buildings. This building was built around 1992 or so, but I had this standing seam metal roof on the top of the building. And you can see the solar panel there on the right-hand side that we just looked at. But from this pulled out view, you can see about a 63 kW system on this building, and we added it to the standing seam metal roof. I mentioned that a couple times because it's important as we kind of go through the next slide. So this is an elementary school that we added an addition to, right below those solar panels was an addition that we added to that building. And you can see that we're kind of iterating, we're trying to learn from different techniques as far as adding solar to our buildings. So the first one was on a standing seam metal roof, low maintenance. I'm not gonna have to deal with that for a while. This one, we actually put on a rubber membrane roof. And then we actually also cantilevered some solar panels off of a gymnasium from the behind. So we're just seeing how it works, seeing if there's any concerns or issues. Next slide. So this is our high school, and this is actually over a brand new competition gym that we put into the building. And you can see we actually created a structure above the gymnasium. Now you see on the bottom there, that first row of solar panels, that we're actually a ton of supports. And so the idea was, well, this will be better because if we ever need to change the roof, which we obviously will, then we don't have to worry about taking the solar panels off. Now, the negative is all of a sudden I have a ton of penetrations into my roof membrane that I have to be very, very careful with. And it's worked fine, but I think that's one of our learnings is, this really isn't the path that we wanted to do. It was nice in that we could kind of actually provide some different angles. You might notice that the first row in each set is a little bit different angle than the second row. And that was done from shading perspective and just actually to kind of maximize the amount of power that was provided. But we're a little concerned about the number of penetrations when everything happened there. Next slide. You'll see the first solar panel was on the left, and then we did a bunch of solar arrays that we just kind of talked about. We also did some geothermal in two of our buildings, our Oregon Middle School and our Oregon High School. We put an addition on where we put geothermal in those buildings. So again, we're learning about those technologies. We hadn't had those technologies in our buildings before. We needed to have people be comfortable with them, learn about them, and just make sure that we were good. The next step was in 2018, we did a referendum and we actually approved the construction of Forest Edge Elementary School. Those main two technologies that make that building net zero are, in fact, solar and geothermal. We use the geothermal to be super efficient for cooling and heating, and then we use the power from the solar panels to make as much power as we need. I haven't mentioned this before, but we've actually been net zero, and that New Building Institute has kind of reviewed that for us 2 years in a row now. So both years we produced around 3.5% more power than we actually used. Next slide. So I've already kind of talked about this a little bit, but this is the overhead of our school. You can see that just about every single piece of the building roof is covered with solar panels. Next slide. It was really important when we actually designed the building to make sure that we didn't provide any shading of the building because all those solar panels have to see the sun as much of the year as possible. So you can see we kind of made some kind of a stepped approach, right? The front of the building is lower than the back of the building, and in order to make sure that we did that. And then we also kind of looked at how the sun would hit the different windows within the building as well. Next slide. This is our geothermal skid for our pumps so that we have redundancy. They're in line. That was something that we hadn't done before. In the past, we had two separate pumps, kind of a backup and a secondary pump that would rotate. But this was an inline system, and it seems to be working really well. Each one of these controls actually tells you how much power that each one's utilizing too. So that's kind of interesting. On the right-hand side, you'll see this in another slide too. We're trying to figure out how we make this building relevant to our students and how we can make sure that they understand kind of what's going on here. Geothermal and solar don't really move around or do much, so we had to get a little creative. So Oregon, Wisconsin is located about 8 miles or so, maybe 9 miles, just directly south of the Wisconsin capital in Madison. So we're a suburb of Madison. And so we took the capital and just flipped it over and then showed how deep the geothermal wells were in comparison. Because most of our students, all of our students, have taken trips to the square here in Madison, Wisconsin and seen the size of that and the mass of it. And so it gives them a real good idea of what that looks like. And then below that, you can kind of also see that we put some information on a small little green roof. Now we would have loved to have done a larger green roof for the building, but unfortunately everything was covered with solar panels. So we found a little couple areas that we could show demonstration projects to our students. Next slide. So there is a cleaner picture that we have with the solar panels. Next slide. The other thing from a business perspective, I knew that, and we'll talk about this in a second, demand is a huge component to our energy bill. So I wanted to try something a little bit different. And what we did was we put a 252 kW battery on the H battery on the building. So we can actually store excess energy that we're not pushing to the grid, and then use that energy to create a little bit more of a building that's not on the grid as much as it could be otherwise. And then we also use this battery more so in the winter when we're using a lot of power to kind of bend the curve a little bit and reduce the amount of energy we use from a demand side. Next slide. So a huge component of this, which I didn't really realize when we started building the building, but I've come to appreciate it over time now as I kind of understand the direction that we're going. Is this building does not use any natural gas at all. It is all electric. So electrification is hugely important. As you probably all know, as the grid gets greener, obviously our buildings get greener in that regard. But that doesn't happen if we're reliant on natural gas supply from our utilities. So the other thing the battery did for us is, rather than putting a generator next to our building, like I have on all my other buildings for backup power, we use that battery to do that, and that helped pay for a little bit of the cost of the battery, so that it was more rational. We could make that rationalization for doing that. So everything in the building is electric. The only thing that isn't is we do have a snow blower that is diesel powered at this point in time, but hoping that we'll be able to move that to electric here in the future too. But even the lawnmower, we use induction cooking, or our stoves are obviously all electric as well. So next slide. We also put in a very, I'd say, unique feature in Wisconsin. I hear that it's more prevalent in the coast, which is a network lighting system. So our lights are all Zigbee talk to each other basically, and then it talks to this network lighting system that we have in the system, a Polaris system. And basically we can kind of see how much lighting we're using, energy we're using for lighting. And we also, if we get into a situation where we don't have any power, or we lose power from the grid, we can actually reduce our light levels to help make the battery last a little bit longer. Obviously, that's completely dependent on type of year or the type of season we're in. In the summer, we would have no problem at all, or even like right now. But in the winter, we'll go through that energy in that battery pretty quick. Next slide. Operational impact. So here's the money component of it. Next slide. So this shows you kind of what happens with the building. The bluish green that's on the bottom side of this graph shows the amount of energy that we're exporting to the grid, and the yellow shows the amount of energy that we're importing from the grid. So obviously, even in June and July, we have some power needs in the evenings after it gets dark. So there's still a little bit of power that we're bringing in, but nowhere near the amount of power that we have to bring in December and January and February. So that's kind of how that works. And the idea is that if the bluish part is more mass, if you add it all together than yellow, then we're net zero at the end of the year. Next slide. So some money, here's from September 2021 to August of 22. So kind of that's the year that we've been using to kind of calculate things. And what we did is we took two other buildings that were comparable in size, kind of on both sides of the building, and related them, and wanted to show the cost associated with those batteries or those buildings compared to Forest Edge at 126,000 square feet. And then we put that into a square footage point of view. And as you can see, the cost is actually less than half of what my other buildings are using. Middle school actually does have, like I said before, some geothermal in it. So it's a pretty efficient building from that perspective, but still we're at 48 cents compared to $1.04 per square foot for the year. Next slide. So then I thought, well, what's happening over time? And even though I only have 2 data points to look at, it's actually interesting that Forest Edge cost is actually going up less than the other 2 buildings related to energy cost. And 22-23, I can't wait to some degree to have that known, because I think it's going to be significantly better than it was last year. Next slide. And to that effect, here's actually the energy bill that I downloaded from the utility yesterday. And as you can see, the bottom total amount due makes a happy business manager when we're paying $39.50 for the last month of service, and we had school every single day of that time period. So what I anticipate will happen is the next 2 months, we'll actually have credits that will build, and that will carry us through probably September, maybe even October, before we'll be paying MG&E again. So again, if you look closely enough to this, you're going to see that the demand costs are the majority of the cost. I'm not using much electricity, and the cost that the utility is buying the electricity for has actually significantly improved or increased. Next slide. Just some real quick components. It's really nice to have a net zero building. It's great to have somebody. It's important to have somebody that has an advocacy for it and has a passion for it and continues to kind of watch the building. We're kind of developing that internal within the school district. It does require some time and to learn, to trust the new technology, make sure that people are comfortable. And it's always important to include those folks in this. Next slide. Teaching and learning impact, I'll go quick because I know I'm probably out of time. You'll see natural light throughout this building. Next slide. That was actually our library. We actually are trying everything we can. We put some murals down. We show how, and we talk to the students about how, solar panels and how that differs or is similar to how trees process energy. And then we talk about the geothermal as well and how that works. Next slide. You can actually see these solar cells from the school, from the second floor. So kids can kind of see them. Again, they don't do much, but they know they're there. And then we actually showed those pipes that actually were on one of the first slides. We put some different viewing areas so the kids could kind of take a look at those pipes anytime they want. Again, not much to see there, but we did color code them type of thing. And then we use green roofs. We also use dual flush toilets in the building, which I was a little fearful of how that would work, but that actually has worked really well. And we use less water per student in this building than our other buildings as well. Next slide. Again, great learning spaces, lots of natural light. The slide on the right is actually a technology that was fairly expensive. It actually keeps the heat out of the building when we don't want it in the building. I call it kind of transition lenses for your building. Basically, it's called Sage Glass, and it actually dims, it tracks the sun, and then based on where the sun is, it shades those windows, and you can see that there, keeping the majority of the heat out of the building when we're cooling it. Next slide. Again, natural light. Next slide. And some really cool places. If you saw the overhead, you could see that we had actually 3 courtyards contained in the building. This is the 3rd courtyard, and actually, if you looked at it today, it would have a bunch of raised garden beds, and the kids are actually making food so that we can include it in our food service program when appropriate. The middle courtyard is actually for our kindergartners. We haven't lost one yet because they'd have to be able to scale like an 8-foot wall or a 10-foot wall, so that they don't get out of there very often. And then the first one's more of a presentation area, so we have a little stage and people can do things in that area. Next slide. And then what's next for Oregon? Just continuing to learn and share as we're doing today. To continue to develop a long-term energy approach. We haven't actually set a goal. Our village is going through that process right now to get to net zero by 2050, and real excited to hear how Denver's approaching that in the next component here, and just to empower future sustainability champions. I had those board members who are real concerned about climate change, and I said, I don't know that our school is gonna, making it net zero. We'll do our part, but the biggest thing that we can do is encourage the next generation behind us to continue to care about this more so than maybe we have. Next slide. And that's it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Highway to Healthy Schools Districts on the Road to Achieving Efficient Carbon Neutral Schools. During our original webinar on May 24th, there was a slight technical issue that caused the recording to go down. So this is a re-recording of that last part of the webinar that has been now incorporated into the full recording. Additionally, the Q&A from the first part of the recording and the second part after we had gotten back up and running will be available in written form on the webpage for the webinar. So thank you to our presenters, Leanne and Adam, for coming back to make sure we get the full effect of your awesome presentation. I believe your introductions were saved on the original recording, but just to be safe, go ahead and introduce yourselves again, and we'll get started. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. So I am Leanne Kittle. I am the Director of Sustainability at Denver Public Schools.
I'm Adam West, Energy Engineer at Denver Public Schools.
And just to give you a quick sense of who Denver is, we are 90,000 students, 15,000 employees, roughly 200 buildings that we manage. We are the largest school district in the state of Colorado. And we have 46 sites with solar on our roofs, 1 ground mount. We have 3 electric buses and 2 charging stations. We have our first solar canopy that's going in at one of our schools over the parking lot. And that is part of a community solar program with the city and county of Denver, where a portion of those arrays, there's 11 arrays across the district, or I'm sorry, across the city, where a portion of that energy is actually going to DPS families in need to help offset their utility bill. We also have 4 schools that are getting solar shades that will enhance our outdoor learning spaces. We have done an LED retrofit district-wide. We also have over 40 schools with e-gauges, real-time data. We have 3 schools with geothermal, 122 gardens across our district. We've embarked on a $31.4 million energy performance contract. We published our first sustainability plan back in 2012, but this is our first climate action plan, which we'll talk about here today, that we just published December of last year. And we have a team of 11 FTEs. And last but certainly not least, our DPS Students for Climate Action, which is a district-wide student club that many students from their school's sustainability club then has formed a district-wide club. And they have received this year the President's Youth Environmental Award, and will be going in August to Washington, D.C. to accept that award. So super proud of our students, and I'll talk about that here in a second. Next slide. So we had 30 students from 8 different schools, 2 years come together to really urge our Board of Education to focus on climate change. And so they went and started a website and got over 4,000 signatures. They spoke to city council members, principals, community leaders, as well as individual Board of Education directors to gain support and urge our board to pass a policy. I'm going to read a quote from one of the leaders of that group. It is, "Look at the news, extreme heat, extreme storms, and extreme weather patterns. The only thing that doesn't seem extreme is our response." And this is really what has changed the tenor of the conversation for us, is that the students have made it very clear that climate anxiety is real for them, and that this global issue is a daily thought for them. So we are now working with urgency. And next slide. The student leadership, as I had talked about, they started their own website. They originally wanted us to focus on clean energy, reducing our carbon emissions, and environmental justice. And we have incorporated all of this into our climate action plan. But they were really focused on us incorporating sustainability into the district's core values, shared core values, as well as preparing them for a green economy also. So that's been the focus for our climate action plan. But the policy that passed unanimously April of last year is DPS shall be a national leader in establishing an organizational culture anchored in sustainability, climate action, and environmental justice, in both the conservation of natural resources and in minimizing the carbon footprint of DPS's practices. Next slide. So in response to this, we again published a climate action plan December of last year and have that on our website, and I'll go over that very quickly here. So as a team, we have a triple bottom line focus. So that's environmental protection, economic prosperity, and social development. And so we have these 2050 goals we call North Star goals that our climate action plan is working towards. So for environmental protection, we have reduced overall greenhouse gas emissions by at least 90% by 2050. For economic prosperity, we're focused on reducing natural resource consumption and waste year over year. And for our social development mission, we want all students and staff engaged in sustainability by 2050. And so 2050 feels very far away. So our climate action plan is actually focused on the next 5 years. So we have 6 frameworks really incorporating sustainability across divisions in our district. And our 6 frameworks are transportation, built environment, resource management, wellness, engagement and environmental justice, and career and curriculum. And so within each of these frameworks, we then have focus areas. And I'll talk about our built environment framework, which we have electrification. So we're really focused on electrifying our HVAC equipment, which Adam will touch on here in a moment. We also want to focus on building envelope. We have a lot of older buildings and want to make sure that if we're going to switch out our HVAC equipment, that we're doing that in the most efficient way with closing up those envelopes, making sure that conditioned air really does stay inside the building. We're also addressing our design standards, make sure those are conducive to electrification and updating those as time goes on. And then smart buildings, we as a district need to figure out what that even means for us. But generally speaking, we're looking to automate as much as possible. Right now, we're only automating our mechanical equipment. We have opportunities for electrical, safety, irrigation, so on and so forth. And then renewables is certainly a focus to offset all that electrification. And then also grounds, creating a landscaping plan over the next 5 years to really focus on heat, vulnerability, water conservation, things like that. So we have a 1-pager, and this is a cutout of that focuses on the built environment and resource management. So the electrification goal that we have over the next 5 years is to electrify 80% of the heating load for 10 of our buildings. And for renewables, we want to hit 65% of electricity supplied to DPS would be renewable. We also built that goal knowing that our utility provider will also be cleaning their grid as well. So under resource management, we have energy management goal to reduce energy consumption by 15% from 2021 baseline. We have done a lot of low-hanging fruit, like our LED retrofits across the district, as well as 27 schools getting a lot of upgrades, capital upgrades from our energy performance contract. So that goal is a bit of a stretch goal, honestly. Also, part of our climate action plan was a greenhouse gas inventory, and this was done because we really wanted this to help prioritize the work. We have 26 goals. We're across all divisions, as you saw in our frameworks. So the greenhouse gas inventory is going to really help us understand what emissions, what is creating the most emissions, and how do we address that. So we have 84% of our emissions coming from building energy. It's almost a 50-50 split of electricity and natural gas. And then we have 13% with transportation and 3% for waste. So that's why we're focused on electrification within our buildings, because that's a huge part. Natural gas is a very volatile fuel source right now. And so we want to get away from natural gas, electrify, and then offset with renewable energy. We also, part of that analysis, had a business as usual emissions projection, which, as you can see, reduces quite a bit, even if we did nothing. And that's really because our utility provider has a lot of diversification portfolio goals to get away from fossil fuels. So if we did nothing, this is how much we would reduce. But as you can see, we still have quite a bit of emissions to get to that 90% reduction. And then as part of this effort towards this policy, we really had to figure out, how are we going to do this? We have all of these goals, and they all sound great on paper, but where does the rubber hit the road? And how do we get there? And so we did a financial impact assessment with 4 scopes as part of that assessment. And this truly is to answer, this is the financial investments you need to make, Denver Public Schools, in order to hit these goals. So the first scope that we had was our current bond, 2020 bond electrification evaluation, was really to understand what was going to be that cost differential, if any, for really to inform us for 2024 capital planning. So for the 2020 bond electrification, we consulted on schools receiving new cooling or cooling upgrades and recommended electrification asset costs. Now, mind you, we did hire an engineering firm to help us with this financial impact assessment. So they're the ones that really helped us develop this scope as well, because this is a relatively new process that's out there. So for 2024 capital planning electrification evaluation, we really want to make sure we're ahead of the game, planning for any potential next bond, and recommend electrification and asset costs. We have roughly 31 schools that still need cooling, and we know that that will be a priority going forward in our capital planning. So how can we electrify those efforts, as well as looking at renewables, which is our third scope that we looked at. And we want to, again, we had that 65% goal, as well as a 100% renewable energy by 2030, which is the students' goal. We recognize that that was probably not going to happen. So we have a goal in the next 5 years to hit 65% of our energy, our electricity supply being clean. So also assessed where we can put renewables and what that cost might look like. And then we did an entire portfolio overview, looking at all of our different systems and really identifying what's easy, what's a little bit harder, and what's the hardest to electrify, so that we can start prioritizing work even outside of the major cooling projects, but then understanding that if we're going to change out a rooftop unit, is that the time to electrify, as an example. So Adam will go over the financial impact assessment.
All right, thanks, Leanne. So just want to show you the summary results from the 2020 electrification assessment. So we did have 14 schools getting new cooling during our 2020 bond. So that's what we looked at for potential electrification. And if we followed all the recommendations from this report, these are some of the results we would see: a 42% reduction in natural gas use, 20% reduction in carbon emissions at 2030, 5% increase in net present cost, and 4% reduction in operating costs. So breaking that down a little more, here are all 14 schools that were getting cooling. We looked at what would be the status quo mechanical system to add cooling to these systems, and what would that cost, versus what would it cost to electrify those systems, largely looking at heat pumps. So you can see the net present cost difference, in some cases actually lower than our status quo, in which case, and a lot of that has to do with saving on mechanical equipment in terms of chilled water piping and chillers and that sort of thing. So in some cases, it can be cheaper than what we were going to normally do. In other cases, as you can see at East or Stedman, it might be cost neutral. You can also see the greenhouse gas reductions from those efforts. And if you look at the bottom, together, if you summarized all 14 schools together, it would be a 5% net present cost increase and a 20% greenhouse gas reduction. Breaking that down a little bit more, what does net present cost mean in the context of this report? Well, we're looking at first costs, cost of construction there, as well as operating costs for the end of the life of the equipment, or I guess for the life of the equipment. And you can see those together will yield a net present cost difference, as well as the CO2 saved there at the bottom. So similarly, for our 2024 capital planning, we also looked at the same sort of schools getting new cooling. We looked at 27, and if we were to follow all the recommendations, here are the results on the slide. Fairly similar in terms of natural gas and carbon reduction, which is neat to see the consistency there. These are all school dependent, so the net present cost increase is a little more at 17%, though we do get more operating cost reduction at around 10%. And again, here is an economic and emissions summary. This time we can't fit all 27 schools on the slide, but same idea, looking at that difference from the status quo mechanical system versus the electrification option, and the totals at the bottom, which I've already covered in the previous slide. Again, we still see some schools, Pioneer, Skinner, Steck, for example, that look to be cheaper net present cost than our status quo options. So what does that look like for each building? Well, as part of this report, different mechanical systems were categorized as sort of easy, medium, and hard to electrify. I'll go over these in more detail in the following slides, but some examples include furnaces and rooftop units that are easy to electrify, medium air handling units, unit ventilators, and hard central natural gas boilers. So I'll go into each of these. So this is a summary across rooftop units for all the schools that were looked at. And actually, sometimes rooftop units can have very negligible increase in first cost. That's due to the fact that when you're adding cooling, you've already got a DX cooling capacity, and a heat pump is essentially just adding a reversing valve. So with a heat pump rooftop unit, you've got a new valve and reversing mechanism, and you add some controls. For all our schools that we're looking at, these are existing school buildings, and given that, there will still be natural gas backup. So at a certain temperature, rooftop units might switch over to natural gas backup. These are limited to smaller rooftop units, 25 tons and under, but these are sort of the low-hanging fruit in terms of electrification. Similarly, air handling units were considered easy to medium to electrify. It really depends on the proximity of the air handling unit with where you're doing your heat exchange. Now, if that's air source, that would be outside, or you could have geothermal on site. So really running the refrigerant lines to the air handling unit from wherever you're doing that heat exchange. And this varies in cost a lot on the first cost, as you can see there, really depends on the school. But significant reduction in natural gas use and greenhouse gas emissions, and those are emissions in 2030. Unit ventilators, we're actually putting a lot of these new vertical unit ventilators. A lot of schools, some of you may be familiar with, have the low horizontal unit ventilators that teachers often stack things on. We're starting to move towards vertical unit ventilators that have a little more room and can fit a heat pump. Again, these are same DX cooling. You've already got the equipment in there. Essentially just add that reversing valve and added controls. Now the difference here in first cost is negligible, as you can see, and high savings in terms of natural gas and emissions there. Now, these are distributed. Even if you were putting these in anyway for cooling, you have a lot of compressors distributed throughout the building. A heat pump doesn't change that at all. So really, this is an easy substitution. And of course, central systems like a steam or hydronic system, natural gas boilers, they're very hard to electrify. Although we are seeing that these could potentially be served by heat pumps in the future. That's sort of an emerging technology. So hopefully in the next handful of years, we'll start to see central systems that have good electrification options. And so looking at the portfolio that was looking at all of our school buildings, we actually had a facility condition assessment that informed this portion, looking at energy efficiency, electrification, and renewables. If we, again, followed all the recommendations, we would see 27% energy cost savings, 38% reduction in natural gas use, and 38% offset of district electricity. And here are the summary results. As Leanne mentioned, we've already done a lot of the low-hanging fruit for efficient equipment, such as district-wide LED retrofit. The energy efficiency first cost is really high because this is replacing entire systems, doing deep energy retrofits. So it's fairly costly energy efficiency measures. Electrification, same idea as before, either end of life replacement of equipment, or if you're adding new capacity. And renewable energy, again, that's the 100% renewable by 2030 goal. And you can see significant savings and carbon savings there. And it's also interesting to see the savings per metric ton of CO2 equivalent, showing that actually the efficiency measures are highest and the electrification measures are lowest for greenhouse gas reduction. So really need to see that. So this is a business as usual and a projected emissions graph. If we followed all the recommendations, we'd have 100% renewable electricity by 2030 and would reduce our emissions 84% by 2050. So the outlined boxes, the outlined columns you'll see there are actually showing what each reduction measure is coming from. It might be hard to see, but you can see, for example, offset electricity emissions due to renewable energy in light blue, and so on and so forth for the rest of the categories. So this shows that these goals are attainable, and we might still have to do a little more work to electrify our buildings and get rid of some natural gas, but following these recommendations would get us very close to our 2050 goal. And as Leanne mentioned, we do have a 2028 goal for renewables. This is looking at that cost difference, or that cost, excuse me, that gap between 65% and what the grid will provide is only 5%. So we're anticipating the grid will be about 60% renewable in 2028. So you can see what that would produce. The cost is upfront cost, 11.5 million, and the potential solar credit, that's new from the Inflation Reduction Act, sort of creating a tax credit for tax exempt organizations. That's 30% normally available to private entities. Some considerations with solar, you want to usually do it on a new or newer roof. Also, renewable energy credits are a consideration. Don't want to get into that too much, but essentially, you need to retain those renewable energy credits to be able to hold on to the greenhouse gas reductions. And you know that you actually can sell the RECs, so it's a little more costly to hold on to them. And some key takeaways to sort of summarize: electrification opportunities are available in every school for this assessment. And you want to consider the building holistically when you're looking at that. So when to consider it? When cooling is being added, so that's a major mechanical retrofit that provides opportunities. When those easy to medium electrified pieces of equipment are at the end of their useful life, when a boiler is being replaced, or when an addition or major renovation is happening. In solar, we have 183 schools that have solar potential. There are tax credits available, as I mentioned, and when to consider, I already mentioned that too, when a roof is being replaced or when you have addition or major renovation. So those are the key takeaways from our financial impact assessment. And that ends our formal presentation. Thanks.
Thank
And
you.
yes, the QR code there is to our website if you care to check us out. We've got a climate action plan. Actually, the website was built around the climate action plan. So thanks.
Thank you both so much for coming back and doing your presentation. I know everyone's going to really appreciate it. And thanks to our presenters from yesterday as well, and all of our attendees. So